It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum and our continuing special series, Aftermath of the Endless War, reckoning with the profound effects on America, its people, and our national security of a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. More than 50 years ago, President Dwight Eisenhower departed the White House with a famous farewell warning to the American people to guard against the influence of a rising military-industrial complex. When President Eisenhower said that in 1961, he was talking mostly about the makers of guns and bombs, not privately financed armies. But in fact, America has a long history with mercenary military forces. Even before the concept of the United States had taken hold, Americans in British uniform battled alongside hired Iroquois fighters against the French and their native allies. A key moment of the American Revolution came when George Washington crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Day, 1776, and took by surprise 900 drunken and distracted German fighters, unclear on exactly why they had been hired by the English king to help suppress what looked to be a hopeless American insurgency against the greatest military power in the world. Americans in 1776 were offended by Britain's use of soldiers for hire, but in recent years, the United States has become enormously dependent on contemporary versions of such fighting forces. Without a draft, America's all-volunteer army has been unable to meet the demands of the war on terror and turned to the assistance of private parties, an ancient answer to the difficulty of modern warfare in a society unwilling to shoulder some of the massive shared sacrifices that war has historically demanded of every nation. Hundreds of thousands of private contractors have provided support or direct military and security services to protect diplomats, embassies, and other critical American targets in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands remain in those countries today. Oftentimes, the number of contractors has matched or exceeded U.S. military personnel. The initial toppling of the Taliban in Afghanistan was substantially credited to the work of private forces contracted by the CIA. In 2010, the Washington Post reported that 265,000 contractors had high-level security clearances, making up almost one-third of the entire U.S. intelligence workforce. Our guests today hold sharply different views on the effectiveness, impact on our national security, and perhaps morality of this changing dimension of American military practice. We're joined by ERIK PRINCE, a former U.S. Navy SEAL and founding CEO of Blackwater, once the best-known and most controversial private military contractor. He's also the author of Civilian Warriors, the inside story of Blackwater and the unsung heroes of the war on terror. Also joining us is ANN HAGEDORN, an award-winning journalist and author. Her most recent book, Invisible Soldiers: How America Outsourced Our Security, is a sharp critique of the increasing privatization of U.S. security. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to have you. This is a big topic and a complicated topic. It's also one that's been in the news recently, and let's just start right there. Your former firm, Blackwater's been in the news. 4 Blackwater employees, ERIK, were sentenced recently to long prison terms in connection with a very controversial episode from 2007 in which Blackwater contractors ended up in a firefight at the end of which there were, I think, 14 Iraqi civilians, 17 by some other counts, who were killed.
It's actually 11.
11. Why those numbers can move around is a mystery to me. But recently, the 4 of those former employees were sentenced to long prison terms, 1 to life in prison, the other 3 to 30-year prison terms, and another contractor pleaded guilty and testified in the trial of those others. In the past and in your book, you've, for the most part, I think, taken the position that to defend what had happened that day, and all of those gentlemen who were recently sentenced maintain their innocence and are appealing their sentences, and we should say that. But at this stage of the game, where do you stand on what happened and the outcome of those court cases?
Look, any innocent loss of life is a tragedy, but making forcing people to make snap judgments in a war zone a few minutes after a large car bomb had gone off requires clear decision making. And we'd asked for cameras. We'd asked for cameras in writing to prevent this very kind of thing, the same kind of thing that you see in police shooting controversies of a dashboard cam to record so there's that third-party witness. We'd asked for those. The State Department denied them. And now these U.S. military veterans who served the military well, who were there doing a job again under the operational control of the State Department, are held to a standard, not necessarily by a jury of their peers. It's hard to have a jury of your peers 7,000 miles away, 7 years later, not having to make those kind of decisions in battle. That being said, and even the charges of they sentenced him for 30 years, based on a firearms charge, really designed to go after cocaine traffickers who are using machine guns, not necessarily a government agent under the operational control of the State Department, issued a weapon by the government. So that case was thrown out once already. The government got a conviction this time. The guys have a very strong case for an appeal, and I will leave it at that.
Ann, you write about the same incident in your book, and you refer to it as privatized mayhem. I mean, your take on that particular episode is very critical in your book, and you quote extensively from the one contractor who testified at the trial, and his description of saying that in fact the civilians had not been warned sufficiently, but I think would be a fair way to describe it, and that there was indiscriminate shooting. So we really have radically different recollections and understandings of that event. But what's your take on it, and what's your response to the way that criminal proceeding where it now stands?
I think we have to get beyond the debate. The debate will continue in court through the appeal. But what is the legacy? What is the lesson learned? And there are many, of course, but the main one is that this approach to what happened in terms of the privatization is so symbolized by what happened at Neser Square. Neser Square was the traffic circle where it occurred. Because the reaction of these men who were working for the contractors, working for the State Department, and they were their job was diplomatic security, and they were entering into a civilian situation. The guns and initial response was violent to a situation that could have been could have been handled in a very different way. And I think what we have to realize is that this strategy for counterinsurgency does not exactly win the hearts and minds of the population. And so you have to see what the recruitment power was for the extremist groups and the enemies. That
you
we
mean
were
that
fighting.
That issue became a rallying call
It became a huge rallying call.
At the time that incident occurred in 2007, I mean, that was at a moment when folks in America really had the feeling that things were just going to hell in a handbasket in Iraq, and were really couldn't tell where things were going. It seemed to be very chaotic, and in some respects, there have been some people who said that private contractors actually ended up being scapegoated to some degree, and it was easier to condemn a group of private Rambos, as people wanted to think of them, rather than facing up to what had perhaps just been a broader debacle of American foreign policy in terms of the whole situation.
Well, I think that the industry itself and the many companies that were involved, I think what is really missed in the story is that there's more to it than Blackwater. Blackwater was a huge company and still is in a new incarnation, but there were many more companies beyond Blackwater and with Blackwater, working with Blackwater in many different functions, from logistics support and armed security for logistics support to air transport, interrogations, intelligence analysis, a vast array of services and
but what about that idea?
security.
Let me just stop you though.
Yeah.
What about that idea?
Have
Contractors gotten more than their fair share of criticism and scorn?
Yes. Well, on a certain level, I think that's true. I think that But largely on a scale of the equivalent to the numbers of private contractors that there are and our dependence on it, I don't think so, because I think that you have to, it's our job as journalists, it's our job as citizens of a democracy to be very aware of who is defending us and securing us.
All right, let's hear from Eric on this now.
Yeah.
In the Vietnam War, when you had a draft, the anti-war left went after the troops. This time it was very easy to go after contractors. And they created, there were some legitimate controversies and a lot of them overinflated and conflated. The fact is, the United States military is very large, very capable, and very expensive. And we have magnificent conventional capabilities going from Kuwait to Baghdad, maneuver warfare, taking down the Iraqi army. But when you turn that huge conventional capability, and now you have to do stability operations and counterinsurgency operations, it creates gaps because the Army can't retask that air defense missile man to be a bodyguard or a trainer or a logistics person. And the military finds it cheaper, simpler, and more effective to find an Indian or a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi that can cook or wash the dishes or do those kind of logistics support functions. So there's a wide range of contracted supplied services because nature hates a vacuum. And if there's a demand signal given by the commanders of the armed forces on the ground, someone can step forward and provide those services. And I disagree with your opening argument about the founding colonists having disdain for contractors because, across the street from the White House you have Lafayette Park, Lafayette, Rochambeau, and Steuben Kosciuszko, contractors, mercenaries, if you will, that came and built the Continental Army. 9 out of 10 ships taken during the American Revolution were taken by privateers. You would say that's a privately contracted vessel.
Yeah, sure. I nearly made reference to them, and in fact, and it's a good point. I mean, I think I specifically said I was referring to the Hessians that they didn't like.
Sure,
they definitely
like the other side, but
the colonists most certainly did. Both, and there were Native American fighters before the Revolution and during the Revolution of the French.
And even the founder of this university, Thomas Jefferson, when he had a real problem with piracy, the Barbary pirates. He turned to a former Army officer, 8 Marines, and 90 contracted mercenaries. That's where the Marines hymn comes from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. They marched from Alexandria to Derna, took down a garrison, and ended up releasing 340 American sailors that had been hostage.
Yeah, so there's certainly a history there. But
it's old, it's present, it's as old as warfare itself, and it's going to be part of warfare in the future. So I agree, there's things we should find on common ground to make it better and more effective because the U.S. military is the most expensive in the world. For 150 years, we had a War Department, and then we shifted to a Defense Department after World War II, and we focused on deterrence. Now, deterrence doesn't really matter against a death cult like ISIS, and so you have to find a way to adapt to not a third-generation war, maneuver warfare, but a long-dwell insurgency, and so you have to focus on being nimble and not having it cost so much. You can afford to stay there for a long time to sort those things out.
And what were you going to say?
We've always had private contractors in the U.S. government, but what's happening now is that the scope has never been wider worldwide, and in the United States, our dependency has never been greater, and the growth of the industry, beyond Blackwater, has exceeded the level of accountability. There are efforts for toward accountability. There's the International Code of Conduct now. There are standards that are trying to be imposed on the armed sector of this business, but it's at the same time the growth and the expansion and the intensity of the dependence in various agencies. It's not just the Department of Defense, it's the State Department, Homeland Security, the CIA,
right.
On and on. And so if you, there can be a use. I've always tried to be fair about this and be open-minded to see what potential these companies have for our defense and security, but how can you utilize them fully without full accountability and transparency? And those are just words, accountability and transparency. But when you look at the details, especially the subcontractors, I think that's the perfect example, because it's not just the U.S. decides to contract with Blackwater or DynCorp or Triple Canopy or any of the others companies, but often there are layers of subcontractors. So we have representatives from many countries in South America and Africa, third world nationals working
so what
for
you're getting
us.
At is
And the accountability on these different levels is very difficult to achieve. And what I'm saying is just that before we go into any second contractors war, or before we go into another contingency operation in which we are dependent on private military and security companies, we have got to complete the job. It has begun, but to complete the job of sufficient accountability. And there are people who believe that that's not possible. When you have an industry that is based on making money from conflict,
let's have some interaction,
right.
Okay? But let's try to break that down, because what you are talking about is a central issue of that. And it cuts both ways, I think. And Eric, tell us what you think about this. That on the one hand, the fact that, for instance, in Afghanistan, that the U.S. was not prepared in September of 2001 to undertake the kind of operation that then was a huge success in Afghanistan and did topple the Taliban. And so the CIA overwhelmingly was reliant on private contractors who were able to move faster and deploy in a different way than the U.S. had the capacity to do. Was a huge success story. The flexibility of private contractors was a big part of that. At the same time, we've seen in other situations, even the one we were just talking about, the question is, are private contractors operating with more discretion at times than they can handle? Do things get out of hand because they're not operating under the kind of command and control structure, the same command and control structure as the military? I think that's the concern of a lot of people. There are also other examples, Benghazi. Sure. But yeah, what's your take on that?
Let me just first clarify. People make Blackwater out to be this enormous company. At its height, we never represented more than 0.1% of the defense budget. So,
well, that's a big budget, though. So that 0.1% of 1% is still a pretty big dollar.
Okay, sure.
But a more important point.
It's a tiny number.
But a point I want to make, though, that I think you're getting at, when we throw around these big numbers, like 250,000 contractors, that's not 250,000 fighting individuals. They're a huge number of cooks and support people, and who are contractors, sure. But much smaller number of soldiers who are part of that picture.
Look, the U.S. military, U.S. government is a particularly lousy buyer of services, or goods for that matter. They don't buy anything really very cost effectively. And I agree that the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about has become realized. When you look at the return on dollars for every dollar that Lockheed or Boeing or Northrop spends for ridiculously overpriced programs, I agree. The taxpayer is not getting good value. When it comes to buying contractor support, focusing on firm fixed price contracts versus cost plus. Look, if you build a house, right? You don't say to the builder, "Go ahead and build it and tell me what it's going to be when you're done." No, you lock in the price and you build the house. And it is possible to do more and more of that through firm fixed price. 97% of our contracts, Blackwater's old contracts, were firm fixed price, doing it exactly that way because we knew our business and we knew how to operate it. Cost plus gives that incentive to run the meter up as high as you can for the vendor to backcharge the taxpayer. So going forward, having more focus on really capable people in the purchasing ranks to do that. In the military, not necessarily sometimes the best and brightest career-wise might go into the infantry or into the combat arms. There hasn't been as much focus on contracting. There needs to be more because if the military is going to depend on those kind of services going forward, they need to make vendors step up their game.
And that's on the financial, the efficiency end. But what about on more the command and control question of are the private contractors the one who are fighting figures, not providing support services? Is there a sufficient mechanism in place at this point?
Sure. Well, look, Blackwater never had fighting figures out there. We had bodyguards.
Okay.
They might have been armed, but they were not there to fight. Look, there is significant dysfunction between DOD or CIA or State Department as to how well they're coordinating. But that goes all the way back to Washington and their dysfunction between those agencies. So contractors are not going to solve that. We just get caught between the plate tectonics of Washington and sometimes get made the scapegoat.
Yeah. But you started to refer to that a minute ago, and really succinctly. What would you say in terms of whether there is a sufficient rules of engagement that can in fact be maintained for private military contractors? I think the suggestion of your book is that there's not sufficient control over, and that contractors end up having more discretion than they can handle. Is that a fair?
Well, that was certainly true in Iraq and has been partially true in Afghanistan. It's part of what ERIK said. It's the nature of the game. I mean, it's really it's combat. You have armed security guards in a war zone. There's a potential for things to happen, but there are ways to prevent that, or there are ways to try very hard and harder to prevent that.
And are those things happening?
And part of that is vetting, training, and also, like I said, getting control of the subcontractor end of the business. But there is an effort. There's an international effort. I think I mentioned it before. That's been in the works since about 2006, and it's a group of a very large group working on international code of conduct, includes industry representatives, and there are standards. Now they're at the point of, I think there are over 700 companies that have signed on to the International Code of Conduct, and now they're at the point of enforcement, which is the crucial point. Can you actually enforce standards in this industry? It's an international industry. It recruits internationally. It performs on all continents. And so this is quite a task.
Is that a legit process?
Standards, vetting, screening, all of that. Much of that was in place already. Look, Blackwater was performing to an 1,100-page contract with very detailed standards for psychological evaluations, criminal background check, hundreds of hours of training, prior military experience, all the rest. It ultimately comes down to judgment. If you're putting people in a difficult situation, can they make that judgment right every time? And I just remind people, in October of 2013, there was an incident on Capitol Hill, or outside the White House, where a woman got into a traffic altercation outside a federal building. Federal law enforcement officers opened fire on her. She drove to another venue. They opened fire on her again. They finally gunned her down up near the Supreme Court. What did they find in the car? No guns, no bombs, no weapons. A black female dental assistant and her infant child in the back, gunned down with hundreds of rounds fired outside federal buildings. There had been no car bombings that day. There was no combat in D.C. that day, but those federal officers opened fire on and killed an innocent woman. No hue and cry. I can't even imagine the noise would have been made if contractors did that. So again, people in difficult situation have to make a split-second judgment, and it's easy to second-guess that 7 years later. It's tough when you're sitting there with a 1,000-pound car bomb rolling at you.
At the same time, though, let's not overlook that the fairly substantive role that these military contractors have played in these operations over time. I mean, I think you make the case not just that it's an efficient way to have bodyguards, but that this is a very effective way. A very effective element of an evolving military strategy on the part of the United States, and that the military contractors have been efficient and successful for the most part. That these are aberrations that we've heard the most about.
As I've said in the past, we employ people. We employed thousands of people. Sometimes people make mistakes. I make mistakes. But we also use turbine engines, and a turbine engine only has 2 or 3 moving parts, and yet turbine engines break. So again, we're striving for perfection, but we're far short of it.
Yeah, but I'm trying to get you to toot your horn a little bit here. The subtitle of your book is "The Unsung Heroes of the War on Terror." So who are those unsung heroes? Tell us that story.
The people we had, and people want to call the guys working for us, for the State Department or overseas, mercenaries. Technically, they don't even meet that definition. We recruited U.S. military veterans the same ones that are lauded on Veterans Day here, who already volunteered to serve America once, and they volunteered to go back again. And we couldn't make them stay in the war zone. They volunteered to do it every day. So we had to provide them a competitive wage, good living conditions, and a reasonable hope of coming home. Okay? Because we couldn't press gang, we couldn't stop loss them. They volunteered to do that job, to fill that gap again. And they wanted to go home when they were done, because they're not there for fighting, they're there for a job. They're there to put their kid through college, to buy a house, and to have a decent retirement.
But the narrative you describe at the beginning of the book is a very powerful story of Bremer getting in danger, and there being an attack on his life, and Blackwater operatives pulling off a very successful operation. You talk about another incident with the Polish ambassador to Iraq in 2007. So there are these...
One of my proudest moments is I spoke at the National War College in Washington, and I got out of the Navy as a lieutenant, and there was 300 colonels there, and they all popped to attention, and I spoke to them about what we did and how we do it, and then a guy came up to me afterwards, and he had been a colonel in Baghdad, a brigade commander, and he said, so he would have had 3,000 or 4,000 people under his command, and he said, on the top of the dashboards of their Humvees were the Blackwater call signs and frequencies, because his men knew that if they got in trouble and they called the Blackwater guys, they would come. No nonsense, no excuses, they would come and help. And then we did that repeatedly, and that was not even... that was certainly well beyond the contracted language, but we also believe the Good Samaritan rule is in effect. So again, you have people that are willing to go and volunteer to do this. To give color on the whole idea of mercenaries or contractors, General Westmoreland, who is the Chief of Staff of the Army in Vietnam, was debating Milton Friedman before Congress when the U.S. switched from a draft to an all-volunteer Army. And Westmoreland said, "I don't want to lead an army of mercenaries." That's how he described the current all-volunteer force, people getting paid a market wage to do a job in a difficult place. And Friedman's answer was, "Well, sir, if you don't want to lead an army of mercenaries, I don't want to be served by a mercenary accountant, a mercenary lawyer, or a mercenary butcher." And that was the last days talked about it, because, look, if you're either being paid a wage for the job you do or you're a slave, right? I mean, you could say someone being forced to join the military, it's involuntary, so we can have an all-volunteer force augmented by private contractors, or you're going to have to go back to conscription. Particularly in an era where you have all kinds of global threats. America can say, we're opting out of that and we're just going to let it fester, or you have to be engaged, but you have to be engaged in a way that is lean, cost-effective, and sustainable, because the current the head count cost for the U.S. Army soldier in Afghanistan this year is $2.2 million a year.
Per person.
Per person. Not for a contractor, for a green suit wearing soldier.
And what's a contractor cost?
Far less than that. I mean, our typical retail billing for a contractor was $1,100 a day. So you annualize that out, that's...
I'm not good at math, but...
$400,000.
Okay.
So it's a fraction.
So, Ann, what's your take on all of that? Is that the case for contractors?
I would love to hear from ERIK what he thinks about the relationship between privatizing, increased dependency on private companies, on the private sector, what Eisenhower did warn about, but it was the weapons makers that he was warning about, and now we're talking about probably 70% of it being service-oriented. And armed and unarmed services, but the question is, doesn't this weaken the link between the people of a democracy and national policy? Doesn't this contribute to indifference in younger generations? And therefore, that to me, that's another definition of national insecurity. The greater the indifference for the future, then the more insecure we should feel.
I think we're past the point of indifference. When you think that less than 0.5% of the population serves the military, so 40 years ago, everyone had served, or most males had. It's much less, the American people can't relate to a soldier as much. But going forward, the ability to volunteer, to serve, to assist, I'm not advocating wholesale outsourcing of the U.S. Army or U.S. Armed Forces or those things. There is a core function that should be done by government employees, active duty service people, But many of the supporting functions around that can be and should be competitively bid, and it will really drive your costs down. See, I'm of the opinion that the defense budget is way too large. Spend more than the next 17 countries combined, the United States taxpayers do. The way to make that cheaper is by competitive bidding for all those other kind of support services. The U.S. military keeps trying to, I call it mow the lawn with a Porsche. You can do that, but it's just really expensive. And when you have supersonic jets designed for state-on-state combat, trying to kill 2 guys in a Toyota pickup truck that are ISIS, it's not a very effective use of resources. So there's all kinds of ways in between there to shave down the cost, the expenditure, and to make the net force much more effective.
So it sounds like you agree in a lot of respects with the idea, this sort of basic notion that it's not a good thing necessarily that so few Americans end up actually directly participating in something like this, that the distance that has set in between the people who fight for our country and the rest of the citizens.
Sure. But that ship sailed 40 years ago.
It's too late to go back on that. I think that's an important area. I'm not sure everybody accepts that that's the case.
You could almost make a case that more contractor participation would have more people exposed to the national security efforts of America than you did, because you're not going to go back to a draft.
Yeah, what's interesting, because historically, getting the boys home, now the boys and the gals home, has been one of the reasons that wars have been brought to an end, and that sense of that we've all got some skin in this game and we don't want it to last any longer than necessary. I think a lot of people fear that all the privatization efforts actually creates a financial incentive to keep these conflicts going for certain parties. But it sounds like you certainly don't see it that way.
Well, that's where oversight and appropriations discipline comes from, and having good government active oversight of those people, leading from the front, not from Washington, leading from the front, empower the decision maker that's there at the field of battle, and don't, we have more admirals than we have ships. So the amount of overhead that exists in the U.S. military is bloated beyond belief. No one could really disagree with that.
What are you going to say, Ann?
What we're missing here, I think, is the concept of allegiance to nation and sort of passionate commitment. And I'm sure, Eric, you believe that the people who worked for you had a passionate commitment. But when you say waiting for them to come home from where? When you have 20% of private contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. nationals coming home from where, and where is the passionate allegiance to nation? And you say, yes, okay, it has been depleting for a long time, and that indifference has been growing. But that doesn't mean that we can just let it go and let it continue to grow and add to it or fuel it. We have to identify what the issues are in terms of a democracy, in terms of the representation.
So is that an
our
argument
representation,
for the draft?
our
is that what you're saying? You're agreeing
image,
with Eric that we need to bring back the draft to try to restore that?
I'm not advocating.
Yeah, but you're saying we would have to. But
Here's
are you
the thing.
saying that that's the direction we should go?
That's a societal question. All right, how many elite students from this elite university are joining the military?
Yeah.
Okay?
Not many.
Exactly.
But some.
How many are even qualified? 70% of all the people military age are even qualified to serve because they're overweight, out of shape, too many drugs, criminal records, or tattoos. Although the tattoo issue, I understand, was just relieved in the last few weeks. Only 70% are not even qualified to join if they wanted to. Okay, so that speaks to a much bigger issue of contractors draft or not. That's a societal problem. But the fact is, you still
We're not going to do a show on obesity.
Exactly, but you have a lot of people. You have barbarians out there. You have barbarians there that want to destroy Western civilization and our way of life. And who is going to prevent that from happening? Active duty forces, of course, supported by contractors.
Americans ultimately may have some cost objections to Pakistanis being the people who are operating the cafeterias in a military complex in Iraq, but they don't have a real...
but it's far cheaper than sending a guy from Ireland.
Exactly. Well, and what I'm saying, though, is that I don't think that's really the issue that Americans are deeply concerned about. What they are more concerned about is the question of who's carrying guns, and the patriotism question you asked, which is a powerful one, is that does someone who presumably, the idea is that a military contractor is there for money, not for loyalty, and I think you were expressing a worry about that. But my point is that military contractors have actually demonstrated a much higher level of patriotism and a willingness to fight to the very end that looks like regular soldiers. So is there really an issue there?
The issues are accountability, reliability, cost. Okay? Accountability, that is a government function, clear definition. Reliability, that's a matter of who you hire. Do you hire people that will stand and do the job done, regardless of whether it's the airplane arriving on time, getting the meal cooked on time, or when the mortars start falling and the enemy starts shooting at you, do you stay or do you run away? And cost. That's a simple apples to apples comparison that you can measure. And when I go back to how the military measures things, the problem with the military is they view all their personnel as a free good. And I give an example. My old company, we used to do vertical replenishment, which is when you embark our helicopter aboard a military supply ship, and we take over the mission of flying supplies from that ship to other ships. We showed up to do that job with 2 helicopters and 8 people, replacing the Navy, who was doing it with 2 helicopters and 35 people. And for every 35 they had deployed, they had another 70 to 100 back in the States, waiting to deploy or just back. So it's very simple to go on an apples-to-apples basis. We were cheaper. The problem is the admiral that says, I need 35 men to do that job, he views them as a free good, right? And when you have a free good, you tend to use a lot more of it. The Navy or the military as a whole has completely lost track of what anything costs, whether it's what does it cost to fly an airplane to do a close air support mission. I mean, for heaven's sakes, flying missions over Iraq, flying bombers from the United States to do that is, to me, fiscal insanity.
Yeah, Al Gore's $50 hammer. But back to the patriotism sort of question that you were trying to raise a minute ago. Is that really an issue?
If the citizens and the youth of America don't understand the impact of war, then how can they be involved in the decision making as we're supposed to be and the voice of the people if they don't have the information actually given to them through a certain level of transparency? And this industry has not and the government has not been open about the use of Blackwater in certain situations. I'm sure it was an issue of national security, but in many situations it was not. And in terms of the covert nature of it,
sure,
we need to be more transparent about it. And just one other point about the cost. When you're looking at the cost-beneficial issues, for one thing, the cost, it's a business. It's a business, you're companies, and you want to cut the costs, and you cut the cost in terms of the subcontracting. And you have examples of not just subcontracting in Benghazi, but there are many examples of problems that sort of bring to light this issue of allegiance to nation.
What's an example of that? Give us one. Give us an example
Well,
of that.
there was one in October of 2009 when some Afghan subcontracted Afghan guards at a U.S. combat outpost, it was attacked and they fled. And in some congressional reports, it shows that they were found sort of huddled in their barracks. This concept, or in Afghanistan, there's another example of subcontractors being part of the Taliban.
Sure.
And so how do you?
Let's pause for a second. Let's let Eric answer.
And many of the government employee diplomatic security agents at Benghazi were found in closets hiding.
And the local
firefight. Those were government employees. So I'm not saying all contractors are great and government people are bad. It's you employ people, and it's about who selects the right people to do that job, and you spool up and have a temporary capability when you need it, and the cost and the legacy tail for the contractors goes away for the taxpayer. If you need a car for a weekend in some other town, you rent one. You don't buy a car and sit on it for a year. In the same way, if you need 500 or 1,000 bodyguards or cooks or whatever, you spool it up, you use it, and then it goes away. You don't have to employ and then cover the insurance and retirement benefits for the next 25 years for more government employees. So you say that there's not transparency or accountability. Look, there's some functions that the U.S. government does that are classified, and that's where you entrust your elected officials on the oversight committees to provide that kind of oversight for what they're doing.
And it's also worth noting that in Benghazi, there were local militia who were had been subcontracted to man the guard posts at the perimeter of
and the entrance.
Exactly, and they disappeared when events began as well. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess that what that suggests then, what you were saying would say that suggests is that we really should have that in order, if you're not going to contract those kinds of services out, then we are talking about a pretty gigantically larger American military force that's capable of doing all of those kinds of functions down to a pretty low level.
We already have the most expensive one in the world.
Okay, but the cost cutting that can occur in the private sector when you are privatizing public functions like this, or public jobs, or inherently governmental jobs, in defense and security, I mean, the cost cutting in order for a company to make money it will go to the labor issue. It will go to the labor level, the care of the contractors. I mean, in 2011, there was a congressional investigation about exploitation of contractors. That sometimes there were wretched living conditions.
And that's where good buying decisions by the U.S. government, good contract officers, prevent those things from happening and weed out the companies that do.
I mean, some of what you're saying is pointing out perhaps an insufficient degree of respect for military contractors and the sacrifices that the bad things that have happened to them. But there has been some talk about that military contractors, particularly now that we have such a heavy reliance on those figures, that they should receive Purple Hearts if they are injured in a combat situation, or that the American society should extend to them some of the kinds of lifetime benefits that a soldier receives if they're injured.
Interesting you bring that up. You mentioned we rescued the Polish ambassador. Our people that were involved in that rescue were actually awarded the equivalent of a Silver Star and a Bronze Star by the Polish government, which is the first time Americans had been recognized since World War II by the Poles. We as a company gave out, it's actually on the back cover of my book, a Blackwater Defensive Liberty Medal to each of our guys that did something exemplary in action. So as a company, we recognize them, but never anything from the government.
But should there be something broader than that? And what does that do to the balance in terms of that? The equation has generally been that an ex-military person goes to work for a military contractor and is paid a higher salary. This is at least the simple description of things. Is likely to make more money personally, but forgoes some of the baked-in lifetime benefits of being a soldier.
Any job security.
Yeah,
because he might get paid higher for that 90-day or 180-day contract, but when it goes away, there's no other job for him. He's looking for a job. I don't think you have to do medals. I don't think the guys do it for medals. They do it because they're professionals and they know how to do that skill set. I mean, look, if you spend 20 years in a SEAL team and a Special Forces unit, you develop a very critical set of skills. Some of those skills apply to a normal commercial life. Some of them might apply in a way that can be very well reutilized by the U.S. government in a temporary basis. So why not?
There's also been a lot of discussion lately. We've had some on this program about post-traumatic stress syndrome, suicide in the military. Some of the traumatic effects of service in these theaters. The focus of that has been on active duty military people. One would assume there's a version of that among private contractors as well. Do you get anxious over whether they are these private contractors whose 180-day contract has expired and they're back out in the workforce? Are they getting the kind of support or care that they ought to be getting? And should we be worried about that?
As a company, I think we set the standard for how we took care of our people. We had a company chaplain, the former chief chaplain of the Marine Corps. We had on-staff psychologists who had interviews before, during, and after the deployments. But we ran our deployments differently. We didn't send them for 15 months like the Army does. We'd send a guy for 60 or 90 days, and they'd be back out. And they'd go back and see their family, kiss their kids, go on vacation, and get back to normal life. putting someone in a hot zone shot at every day for 15 months. So I think the incidence, if you look at the statistics of PTSD and those kind of problems amongst contractors, is significantly lower. And they're also volunteering to go every day.
Well, I think that it loops back to the issue of transparency and a recognition that this is an industry, that it's an industry beyond Blackwater, that it's and that it should be approached as something. If we are embracing this and depending on these companies, then we have to bring the contractors into the fold, and it has to be transparent. It has to be part of the system. I mean, there are people I've talked to who want a regulatory commission for private military and security contractors, and I can see ERIK smirking, more government, but there needs to be a greater, with the increasing dependence and the scope of this, and way beyond Blackwater at this point, internationally way beyond Blackwater, then there has to be an approach that's not based in the era of Blackwater. There are standards being discussed in Congress, but those standards are related to the Department of Defense only. The State Department has a tremendous private security
and
budget.
Eric, you'd agree that those things should be are not coordinated, are not standard,
completely uncoordinated.
Right.
Yeah,
and
they need to be coordinated and centralized. If it's going to,
that would assume the Appropriations Committee in Congress that appropriates the money for each of those agencies could actually even coordinate to a common standard. So that
some people
that
call
speaks
it a fourth branch. There are people who call this, privatization a fourth branch of the government, and it's if that's true that. We're in trouble if we go forward into what people also call the second contractors war, the potential of that, and also if we, I would really like to talk about ISIS and the concept.
Well, let's talk about ISIS, and let me pose it this way, pose the question this way, and I'm really curious to hear where you would go with this, but let's start with Eric first. In terms of ISIS, that's a situation that the United States can't seem to quite decide what it wants to do or what it can do as a nation, as a national institution, or how to use the military. I've heard a fair number of people say, why isn't this exactly the situation that the United States or somebody hires a Blackwater or somebody else to go in and do the things that the United States is unwilling to send its soldiers to do? Is that part of how the future ought to work?
Well, that's how the past has been. That's how maybe not the present is, but it's certainly a possibility for the future. If there's that kind of demand signal that said, company ABC, assemble me a 5,000-man brigade, give me artillery, armor, some infantry, vehicles, and air to conventionally sweep ISIS from Iraq and destroy them, it is possible for the private sector to organize that. There would be no problems recruiting, and you don't need state-of-the-art equipment to do that.
And does that freak you out, what he just said?
Well, it concerns me tremendously because I want to know, the reason I thought we should discuss it is I would like to know what the structure and the authority would be for such a force.
Yeah. Stop there. What would the structure and authority be over in a force like that?
That's to be determined by the National Command Authority.
Yeah, but what should it be? What are you going to tell them it should be?
Put a flag officer in charge, and we give very clear right and left flank of what the rules of engagement are. What are the objectives? Spell them out, and then go.
But shouldn't the initiative, this industry should be supplying military support, as we're talking about, and not, it's the government that should be in control of a strategy.
You put a active serving flag officer in charge of the overall command and control. I just gave you the hypothetical that if you needed to, because there's talk of you need boots on the ground, but there's no U.S. boots on the ground. Okay, whose boots? You can hire them.
Good question. Whose boots? Where would these people come from? And what's the training and the vetting what's the how?
You could actually do it with all Americans. You could do it cost effectively with all Americans if you wanted to. If you think about a Marine that spent 6 years as a machine gunner or working on a tank, and now he's maybe going to community college, and he's working for his brother's landscaping business, and you offered him a $90,000 salary with the opportunity to go back to with his colleagues to go fight ISIS, there'd be plenty of guys that would take that job.
And what about the idea of someone...
and those are the same U.S. military people that were just there 5 years previous in uniform. So do you trust them less because they're not wearing an active duty service? Because once a Marine, always a Marine.
And what if some government other than the United States government wanted Blackwater to, or a Blackwater-like company to do the same thing with an all-American force?
That's a regulated activity by the U.S. So a U.S. company could not do that.
Should they be able to? I mean, is that the sort of thing that comes onto the table if this world evolves in the way that we've been talking about?
The U.S. can't certainly control the decisions of other nations, and I believe there will be significant demand signals given by other nations that want to do that need more support for those kind of things. So the demand signal's coming. Whether the U.S. is going to be part of it or not, that remains to be seen. But it's going to happen because, as I said, this is as old as warfare itself. The idea of fighting the big one, okay, like World War II, that the U.S. military has been built and equipped for the last 70 years. Very rarely, fortunately, does the big one ever come. So there's going to be lots of small brush fires, and so that hybrid mix of active duty, supported by contractors in some role, is going to happen. It's inevitable. Accept that.
And I'm still, I think you've conveyed pretty clearly your anxieties about a lot of this, and you quote in the book from a report, the Commission on Wartime Contracting, a report that came out in 2011 that expressed alarm about the use of military contractors and ended with reform is essential now. Reform will save lives and money and support U.S. interests. But I'm not entirely clear. I understand anxieties. I'm not entirely clear, though, what exactly is the reform that a report like that, or that in toto, the argument that you're making, what exactly is the reform in a really tangible way that you would say ought to be happening, or that report would?
Well, that report actually listed about 25 suggestions, and some of those have been, I've mentioned, some of those have been taken to Congress. For example, in the issue of foreign contractors and our enlisting foreign contractors under U.S. contracts, there's $38.5 billion in a category called miscellaneous foreign contractors without any list of the jobs they performed or the names of the companies. And it also points out between about 30 and 60 billion, they could not identify it exactly how much, but between 30 and 60 billion dollars in waste and fraud. So that was a report that came out in August of 2011. And there have been efforts to increase the accountability.
You had anxieties. I had anxieties as well. I mean, for the 10 years I owned the business with people deployed, my phone never shut off, ever. And so the 2 a.m. call that a helicopter had been shot down or men had been killed, we lost 41 of our men doing that job. There is a model for overseas contracting that I think the U.S. could follow better. When you look at the global large-scale construction infrastructure companies and large-scale oil and gas. Okay, it might make those terms might make some people nervous, but the fact is they do multi-billion-dollar jobs in different places, hard places, remote places, difficult to monitor places. They spend billions of dollars cost-effectively because they're spending their own money drilling, exploring, making something happen. So there's plenty of models of people doing difficult things in difficult places that the government can model how they do oversight, how they do contract management to prevent the constant overbilling.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the
actually, let me pause you there because I think we've actually arrived at a little piece of a bit of consensus there, no, don't shake hands yet. But I did want to, I wanted to come back to you, Eric, the one last time because you began to touch on it just there, and I think we'll have to finish with this. But as you did do this for 10 years, you've been in the hot seat both for things you did and things you had nothing to do with through this whole period of time. You're sort of the face of this phenomenon for a lot of people. But you look back over that period of time. One, some people say, particularly in the aftermath of the sentences of these former employees of yours, some would say that the company should have suffered in some more tangible way because of those instances, and maybe that you should have suffered as the architect of the company. And I'd like to hear from you on that. But the other thing, and just a final thought, as you look back over this period of time, are there things that you would do differently, having learned what you have learned now? Are there things that could have been avoided in some way that you've got an insight into now that you didn't have 8 or 10 years ago?
Sure, I regret ever working for the State Department. Look, at the end of the day, it's just not worth it, because we did more than 100,000 missions. None of their people were ever killed or injured. Our men fired their weapons less than 0.5% of all those missions. And for the company to be wrecked and defined by one incident that went bad one day, it's not fair. But life's not fair, and for whatever nonsense the company or I have had to put up with, men have lost their lives, men are incarcerated, 41 of our men were killed, hundreds severely wounded, and not to mention the thousands of active soldiers that paid an infinitely higher price. So war is hard, war is bad, and it should be avoided as much as possible. But unfortunately, there are some people that want to destroy our way of life. I travel extensively, I encounter those kind of places and people. And so that's just a reality that, fortunately, most Americans are oblivious to, and hopefully they can stay that way.
We're going to be continuing to reckon with these questions for a long time to come, so thank you both very, very much. ANN HAGEDORN, ERIK PRINCE, thank you both for being here.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
The books are Civilian Warriors and Invisible Soldiers. To send us a comment about this program, to download a podcast of this or other episodes, or to read a transcript, visit us at millercenter.org, where American Forum is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next time.